Hello, welcome back. Today we're going to do chapter 6, and I'm going to try to talk about some historicism and philosophy. I say try on this because I don't pretend to be a philosopher. My degree's in English. The best that I can do is give you the information that I had when I was studying literature, particularly women in literature. And in studying American literature, the reason if you ever decide to go and get an English degree, you're required to take some survey classes, right? So you want to have an idea of where this all originated and what makes it uniquely American. Rather than, British literature. And, our history has played a big part of that. And the shape of the novel, you see just with the point of view, with something like Moby Dick or Huckleberry Finn, and then, of course, The Great Gatsby. And this particular book, The Great Gatsby, couldn't be any other place but America. It's uniquely us. So I butchered Langston Hughes' poem. I was just trying to think of it. I'm not good at writing down what I'm going to prepare, what I'm going to teach. Sometimes that's why it seems like I'm sort of thinking of things to say, because I am, and because sometimes the best things that I have to offer, I could never plan. And it comes from kind of just years of studying and reading, and I never know what's going to come up. And so I can't force it. So I just hope you're patient with me and during those times, but I can do a much better job if I just sort of naturally talk rather than have, a bunch of notes. But for this case, today I may actually have to put together a PowerPoint for you to understand this, because I'm going to go in a little more theory and then look at the text and try to help you see what I see and what others see. But what my goal is always to have you reading and connecting this skill, using this skill to relate it to other pieces. And so that when you get cold reads, and you will in the AP test, you can look at it and think about everything that you, as far as your background knowledge, that if you take more than just this course, you're going to have a lot, and you can apply it just by looking at a date, or even just knowing if it's American literature opposed to a British piece. So I want to look at the poem just real quick of I Too Sing America. Actually, the title is I Too. So we'll pull that up, and and if you really want to treat, you should just go to YouTube and Google The Great Debaters, Denzel Washington scenes or whatever, and let him read this, because it's wonderful. Okay, but I too sing America. I am the darker brother. They send me to eat in the kitchen when company comes. But I laugh and eat well and grow strong. Tomorrow I'll be at the table when company comes. Nobody will dare say to me, eat in the kitchen. Then, besides, they'll see how beautiful I am and be ashamed. I, too, am America. This is also a poem I would bring up. I'm definitely going to go back to Langston Hughes when I talk about Zora Neale Hurston, because those two were actually friends. They actually wrote a play together too, but they'll leave that for another course. But this is also the Jazz Age and the Harlem Renaissance go together, and so new voices were coming up during this time, and Langston Hughes certainly was one of them, and had a good influence on literature. So there's a quote I found from him that I'm going to say in a few minutes. So that's kind of what made me want to go back and look at that poem. And what we're going to talk about in the beginning is the Patriarchal Society and a little bit of literature and identity and how that all fits in. I've said this in other courses, and if you know me at all, you've heard me make this argument. When we talk about a patriarchal society, some people get a little defensive about it, and they kind of want to close their mind to it. But just consider a couple of questions. First of all, do we have double standards between men and women? Do we have different expectations of them? If a girl, especially in high school, is promiscuous, and let's say she sleeps around, what is she typically called by her society? What kind of reputation will she probably have? Now let's say a guy equally as promiscuous and goes out, does the same thing. I asked a class this once, and one of my students said, legend. So we have a whore and a legend for doing the same act. So obviously there's some double standards. I often wondered about this growing up, as I grew up with a brother, and not that I was an angel by any means, but there was just different standards in what was okay for me to do and what was okay for him to do. And I think that, we do that to our kids still, mainly to protect the girl, but there's also, a different, my dad used to say, it's just not proper. And I would say, well, why not? And he really wouldn't have an answer. It was just not proper for me to say certain things or whatever. So if we know that is true, then we have to ask, where does it come from? The other question, and because when you look at gender, you also can use the same paradigm for minorities. And if we ask ourselves, do we have stereotypes? Yeah, we do. We stereotype people all the time, especially people of another culture that seem, different. So there you go. So obviously there's something wrong with that. And so what I'm going to talk about today is how it starts with identity. Well, feminism kind of had two waves of thought. One wave was that the immediate need was all about equality, right? And that's because women wanted to vote. They needed equal rights. But the problem with equality is, just looking at it as an ideology or philosophy, it's very limited. And what it did was just kind of undermine feminism in a way that, making women less feminine in order to fit in. And women were willing to do this. So to be equal, it was like they were kind of trying to make themselves more masculine, rather than just say, I'm just as important as, with feminine qualities as you are with your masculine qualities. I don't have to, in other words, change for you. And so if you look at this also with minorities in literature, some people were accused of being, too white or white to fit in, And Langston Hughes, that's why I thought of this today, had this to say: "This is a mountain standing in the way of any true Negro art in America. The urge within the race towards whiteness. The desire to pour racial individuality into the mold of American standards, and to be as little Negro and as much American as possible. Okay, so when you think about that second wave, and what Langston Hughes was arguing was that we don't have to change. We can still be who we are and create art, and it can be uniquely ours. And that's really what the Harlem Renaissance was about. It was about celebrating that diversity. And this is the jazz age. And so, different voices are finally getting to speak up, and they're very talented, especially as musicians. So why do we have to undermine that identity? And I think identity is dealing with equality. It's not ignoring equality. It's getting to the root of the problem rather than just saying, we need equality. We need people to stop, stereotyping. We need people to be more accepting of immigrants or whatever. But to do that, we have to be educated. And so with identity, I'm going to bring up Virginia Woolf. And at some point, I definitely want to do a course on Virginia Woolf because I think she's just fascinating. And her work is very hard to read. She's, like, for instance, Mrs. Dalloway is about one day of a woman's life. If you remember, I told you before, plot really doesn't matter. It really doesn't matter. And yet she's finding her way of writing in a feminine style because, and I'm going to use this philosopher later on, like Chris Davis says, women, space and time is different from men. There was years ago a guy wrote, John Gray wrote, women are from Mars, men are from Venus. I may be mixing that up. I may be mixing the two up, but either way, we're from different planets, right? And so he would say you'd have to talk to the other one in a different language. And it was really popular. But the truth was that there is more of men are more associated with kind of a linear way of thinking, right? And women think more like a web. And I think this has to do with having to think about children and domestic things and whatever else on top of whatever you're doing, which is problematic for women as writers. In fact, Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own, it was an essay in response to a question to her about, well, if women are, equal to men in their talent, why were there not more women writers? Now, you could answer this question just looking at the 1950s. And you would see the man coming home and the dutiful wife would get the children out of the way. Don't interrupt your father, let him relax. He just got home from work. And he's got his newspaper and he's reading and he's having just some quiet time. Now men, good husbands, have realized that it's women who really need that quality time and that quiet time, especially when they stay home with children all day. So when was a woman, especially during 18th century, 19th century, and before that, have any kind of space to say, you know what, she's working on a book and she needs to be left alone? That was unheard of. Virginia Woolf didn't even have kids, and she complained about servants just bothering her, interrupting her. What do you want for lunch? I can't even imagine that, because I've tried to write a book on top of teaching, and it's nearly impossible. So Virginia Woolf's answer was that they needed room. And the room is not just, I'm going to have my own room, even though that would be nice. The room is the space in your own creative mind where you can put aside everybody else, even your own kids, and not have to think about them. That's a very hard thing for a woman to do, or for someone to come in and say, yeah, she definitely needs to do that because she needs to write. Virginia Woolf's husband was very supportive, by the way. So anyway, she said that with that being a problem, and without money and means, then you're not going to have as many writers. The other issue is there wasn't a lot of women writers before her and before these other women to look at and, get some identity of what that looks like. And I'll give you an example. Someone like Zora Neale Hurston, who wrote Their Eyes Are Watching God, which is going to be one of the courses that I do right after this. She didn't really have anybody to model after or to look at. So she used what she could was folklore and those kind of tales, those things that she was told, just people telling stories on the porch. That is what really gave voice to her literature. And it wasn't until, it would have been completely lost if it weren't for Alice Walker, who also, a black woman looking for somebody to inspire, to look like, just to model or whatever, and couldn't find anybody. It wasn't too long ago I was listening to a interview Oprah Winfrey, and she was talking about kind of her road to success, and she said when she was a little girl she had only Buckwheat, which he was on the Rascals, the Little Rascals, as a mentor, as a here's someone to look at. Imagine trying to see yourself on TV, but nobody resembles you. And that's your dream. And so this lack of identity of, well, what does women's literature really look like? And here's another thing. Who wants to read about, especially during, this time when you have a war going on, women talking about domestic stories or, just everyday things of taking care of the children? That was kind of a problem too. So Mrs. Dalloway is just about a woman who wants to throw a party all day long. She's just trying to throw a party, but it has a lot more layers to that. It's a lot more complicated than that, and so hopefully you'll join me for that one. But at any rate, thank God Alice Walker literally resurrected the work, and it ended up being a part of the canon, which is why it's also on the AP list. So that would give you kind of a different, there's not a whole lot out there, so anytime you have an opportunity to read something that's, not the typical white male, hate to put it that way, but it has, you want to be able to talk about those issues, which brings me into the issue of books being racist. And if you look at something like Heart of Darkness, Chinua Achebe criticized Heart of Darkness for being racist. Now he's not looking at just some problems with the language. Like when you hear about something like Huckleberry Finn not being approved, or and all these people are looking at is they see the N-word and then they think, oh no, it's racist. Well, even AP has a statement about things that seem to be inappropriate. If it's a detail, it's a detail. If it's something that's not conveying a theme of the meaning of the work, so like To Kill a Mockingbird is the opposite. It promotes tolerance. So someone to see that one detail and say it's racist is just ignorant. And so that's not what he's doing there. The problem, what he says about Heart of Darkness, and this is about, it's really about colonialism, and Heart of Darkness is it's set in Africa, and it's kind of how they take advantage of of the Africans, and they're making, of course, a lot of money. And Conrad was not, I don't think, purposely writing a racist book, because the heart of darkness is not in Africa. The heart of darkness is in us, and in the greed and wanting to take advantage. That's where the real darkness is at, is in our own hearts. So I don't think that he was doing that, but I see the point, and I like to make this point because I think it's important to bring up that he says that heart of darkness projects the image of Africa as the other world, the antithesis of Europe, and therefore civilization. And so the people that are in the novel, and there's not a whole lot of people besides the narrator and Kurtz. The Africans are in the background, kind of voiceless and faceless. And this book, of course, it's on the AP list as well. This book is so popular among just anyone getting an English degree. You've read it. It's studied so much that he felt like this is the only portrayal and image that people have of Africa. And so when he wrote Things Fall Apart, which is also is something that you could write about on the AP test if you wanted to study that book, he's giving a more accurate description and identity to Africans. Okay, so I agree with the notion that he says that this is misrepresenting. And when I took that, when I took women in literature, and we were reading Heart of Darkness, there's not really any women in there either, and they play a very minimal role. And the Great Gatsby, we were saying that too, and you've seen. Between Jordan, Daisy, is there a good woman character? No, there isn't. And I thought, in the beginning, when I was trying to understand this, I didn't understand why she would pick those books. I understand it now, because my argument, it would be as to why we should continue reading and studying something like Heart of Darkness, is so that we have a way to identify the issues and talk about them. Because if we don't talk about it, we don't recognize it, we're not going to recognize it in our own politics. And we won't recognize it in our own propaganda. And we won't understand why something may be seen as offensive or racist. Okay? So, and it was only through studying that. It's not like studying those books made me racist. It was on the opposite effect. It made me more aware of language and what leads to racism. Or in literature, with a minority or women, what you would say is the other with a capital O. So what makes the other other? And I want to get into that a little bit later. So, but the American religion, going back to that, this chapter is interesting because he tells the real story behind Gatsby. I suppose he had the name ready for a long time, even then. His parents were shiftless and unsuccessful farm people. His imagination had never really accepted them as parents at all. The truth was that J. Gatsby of West Egg, Long Island, sprang from the Platonic conception of himself. He was a son of God, a phrase which, if it means anything, means just that, and that he must be about his Father's business, the service of a vast, vulgar, and meretricious beauty. And meretricious means that in reality it's not, let me make sure I'm saying this right. It's attractive, but it doesn't really have true value. So what is he then saying about his Father's business, the Father being a capital F, meaning God? and that this service is, it's certainly not in the Christian sense of whatever he means by that. It means kind of the making of, it really leans more towards an idea towards capitalism than it does religion. So what I have to try to explain here, if you look at, if you study American literature, you go back and you look at the writings that people like John Cotton and John Winthrop and trying to think who else I read, and Bradstreet, Puritans, who basically their writing was more like journals and so forth. And we also looked at some Native American literature, some early literature that had been passed down, probably in the beginning orally, but then eventually written down. And to see the two juxtaposed, what you understood was from the colonial side, they were coming at it as like I said before, the chosen people. They believed God was on their side. And so if a battle happened and the Indians were fighting, then the devil was lurking around and causing trouble. However, if they had beaten the Indians in some way, or their crops were growing very well, then God's providence was obviously there. And so this is not really that far off, though, in what people believe with religion, if you look at it politically. Where does that idea come from, the sense that we are the center of the universe? It came from separating the people who came, the early settlers were separatist. They separated from tradition, they separated from the church, and now they were able to kind of create their own narrative. Sure, they took some of that with them, but they are coming up with their own doctrine. And then you start to see, once the church breaks, it continues to divide. When I mean it divides and divides and divides, because somebody might get upset about something and want to change something, and then you just do it, right? So what I like to do, just as a juxtaposition to this, as we start getting into the idea of American identity, is to look at Jewish identity. And look, I love the play Fiddler on the Roof. It's just extraordinary. If you have never seen it, and most young people have not seen it, so please do yourself a favor and watch it. But in the beginning, he's talking about tradition, and he says, because of our tradition, every man knows who he is and what God expects him to do. Now, think about that compared to a lost generation of people. Of, like in the beginning when we would talk about American culture, and it's, well, what is our culture? And people would say it's kind of like we don't have one, and we're like the melting pot and so on and so forth. So not having that tradition, it's very hard to say, this is who we are, this is what we believe, this is our creed. And you start to see the creed just kind of go away with different religions. Then you have this phenomenon called Transcendentalism. And this is where people like Emerson and Thoreau, and probably even people like Ben Franklin, look at religion and nature and man, and they try to make sense of it. But what I'm going to suggest is that what they project onto God derives from their beliefs. So no longer are we made in the image of God, or do we make God in our own image? I don't remember who said it, but there was an Orthodox saying that it's about, embracing the mystery of God, and what his argument is simply, if God can be known and understood, then he can't be God. There has to be that mystery and that separation. But if we can create our own new version of ourselves, then we can also create a new version of what we project onto God. And and I hear people talk about this a lot, especially people who are very on the fence about religion. They will say, well, I don't think that a God would do such and such. And they're taking it from, this is who I am and what I believe, and because I'm this way, then I'm going to project that onto God. And so, like I said before, nobody really, it happens, and yet no one really questions it. So you can do that. And this is, I think, what he's saying about Gatsby being, quote, a son of God. Like, he's about his father's business.